Hey guys, in today's lecture we'll be discussing the fourth act of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So far we discussed the first three acts. In the introductory scene we were introduced to two characters, a man named Francis and an old man. Both of them were sitting in a bench in a forested wilderness when a ghostly woman walks by and Francis says to the old man that she was his fiancée. Suddenly the old man says, and the title card reads, "Spirits surround us on every side. They have driven me from my hearth and home, from my wife and child." So the old man might have mistaken the young woman to a ghostly figure or an apparition. That is why he said that we can see ghosts everywhere, or spirits surround us on every side. They had driven me from my home and hearth and from my wife and child. So the spirits, or the presence of spirits, has driven the old man from his home and hearth, from his wife and children. In the next scene, a flashback begins. We are introduced to two more characters. Again, we are reintroduced to Francis, and then other two characters are introduced, and they are Alan and Jane. Francis and Alan were close friends, and both of them loved a woman named Jane. They were contesting with each other for her love. They appear jubilant and happy because they are young and in love. Suddenly they read a notice which tells that a fair is said to happen in Holston Wall. In the next scene, we are introduced to Dr. Caligari. From his appearance itself, he seems a little off. Dr. Caligari has a menacing face. Dr. Caligari reaches the town clerk's office and he requests the town clerk to give him a permit to showcase a somnambulist in the fair. The somnambulist's name is Caesar. At first, the town clerk does not mind him, but later on, he gives him permission to showcase the somnambulist. In the next scene, all the major characters meet with each other as Francis and Alan goes to the fair. There, they go to the stall of Dr. Caligari and the somnambulist Caesar. Once they enter the tent, Caligari says that Caesar, the somnambulist, has been asleep ever since his birth, and now he has woken up, and he would be able to see through the past, present, and future, or he is able to see the past, present, and the future. So he asked the audience to shout out a question at the somnambulist, because the somnambulist could see the past, present, and the future. He could see through the past, present, and the future, so he would be able to answer the audience's questions. At that time, Alan poses a question to the somnambulist. And what is that question? Alan asks somnambulist, "How long would I live?" And as an answer to Alan's question, the somnambulist says that you won't live to see the daybreak. So Alan is terrified. So is Francis, because the somnambulist just said that Alan would not see the daybreak, which means that Alan would be murdered the very same day. Disheartened by Caesar's prophecy, Alan and Francis decide to leave the scene and they move towards their respective homes. Before parting ways, they come to know that town clerk has been murdered and a murderer is on loose. That very night, Alan is brutally murdered by a shadowy figure. We are not revealed the identity of the person, even the audience does not see him, but we just see a shadowy figure. Director Robert Wayne has introduced chiaroscuro effect throughout this movie to intensify feelings of fear, pain, and anger. The death of Alan also appears to be highly symbolic. We don't get to see who murdered him. We get to see is his arms trying to compact the murderer. The next morning, Francis comes to know about Alan's death. He is shocked, he is terrified, and he knows deep within that the somnambulist had something to do with Alan's death, because it was the somnambulist who revealed that Alan would die the same night. So Francis is highly suspicious of the somnambulist Cesare as well as Dr. Caligari. He shares his doubts with the local police and also with Dr. Olson, who happens to be Jane's father. Together, Dr. Olson and Francis go to Dr. Caligari's tent and they check the premise. Dr. Caligari reveals that Alan sleeps for the most of the time, and even when Dr. Olson and Francis pays the visit, Alan is still sleeping in a coffin-like structure, a cabinet. When they leave Caligari's house, they happen to read another newspaper article, and the article says that the murderer in Holston has been captured. Now, in another scene, we were also shown that a man had killed an old woman. The man's identity is also revealed. He appears as a thief and he has committed the crime of murdering an old woman, and the police were able to catch this person. So the police has labeled him to be the murderer behind the deaths of the town clerk and Alan. So he is charged with the murders of Alan, the town clerk, and the old lady. Now that's how Act 3 ended. Now we shall move on with Act 4. In this act, the first character to be introduced is Jane. She is anxious about the prolonged absence of her father. We shall take a look at the scene. Now see, Jane is anxious because her father has not yet returned. Her father is Dr. Olson, and he had gone with Francis to inquire about Alan's death. She's all alone in the house, and again see the backdrop. So see here, Jane is seen reading a book, and she is in a cozy setting. Unlike all the other places that were shown in this particular movie, in Jane's house, in the background you can see curved lines. So in all the other places we saw sharp lines, right? But here on the background there are curved lines which indicate calmness. And even the furniture that is there, it's all curved. So the entire setting is calm, unlike all the other places that we have seen so far. In all the other places, we saw strange shapes, distorted images, sharp backgrounds, etc. But here everything is curvy, and there is even a flower pot which is kept here, right? And it seems like she has kept a flower here in this flower pot, and it is also ornately decorated. So this is a very calm place as opposed to all the other places that we have seen throughout the movie. This is a refreshing change. And the kind of clothes that she is wearing is also mellowed down. In the next scene, we are at the inspector's office. The thief has been caught, and now Francis needs answers from him. The murderer speaks. "It is true that I tried to kill the old woman," but then he reveals, "and I thought they would blame the mysterious murderer again." So see, here it seems like this man whom the police has caught was a copycat murderer. All that he did was he killed the old woman against whom he held a grudge, and he wanted to put the blame on the original Holston murderer. So this man whom the police caught is just a copycat murderer. നമ്മളൊരു മർഡർ നടക്കുമ്പോൾ ചില കോപ്പി കാറ്റ് മർഡറേഴ്സ് ഉണ്ടാവാറുണ്ട്. If there is a ripper on loose, other murders too would be committed in the same manner so that the blame would be put on the ripper or the serial killer. Similar to that, here again, this man, this murderer, wanted to put the blame of killing the old woman on the murderer who is let loose in Holston. And that is why he committed the murder. So that is the grand revelation that he makes. He says, "But I swear I had nothing to do with the other two murders. So help me God." So he is asking for salvation, and he is asking for help, and he admits that he did kill the old lady, and he wanted to frame the Holston Wall murderer for the death of the old lady, but he didn't commit the other two murders. He didn't kill the town clerk. He didn't kill Alan. Now again, Francis is perplexed because he knows that the real killer is let loose. And he somehow knows that Dr. Caligari and the somnambulist is behind the murders. Again, Jane is introduced. Jane is going to the fair. She wants to know some answers. So she decides to go to the fair. And since she hadn't seen her father for long, she's also worried about him. And she knows that her father had gone to see Dr. Caligari and the somnambulist. That is the reason why she visits the fair. And she comes across Dr. Caligari. She is afraid of him. And she asks, I thought I might find my father, Dr. Olson, here. So she has come there in search of her father, Dr. Olson. Now Caligari cunningly invites Jane inside the tent. Jane is a bit reluctant, but still she agrees. She visits Caligari's tent. Once inside, Caligari shows her Cesare, the cabinet in which Cesare sleeps, and he shows her Cesare. Now Cesare is fast asleep. Still she is afraid of him because she knows that maybe the somnambulist is behind Alan's murder. Now as she peers deep into his eyes, Cesare opens his eyes and looks at her. See the stare that he gives? This is intense, right? And in those days, this might have been an intense scene. Now, in ghost stories and in ghost movies, there are certain incidents, events, or even scenes that depict the menacing realities, right? So here again, in this scene, you can see Cesare staring at Jane. And this is a very powerful stare, right? So the audience might have felt chills when they saw him staring at Jane, and she herself is shown as being pretty much afraid. At night, Francis again goes in search of Dr. Caligari. He wants to find some answers. He enters Dr. Caligari's tent. Quite secretively, he visits Dr. Caligari's tent and he peers through the opening of the tent, and he couldn't find anyone there. So he goes straight to Dr. Caligari's house. Here again, he peers through the window of Dr. Caligari's house. There he sees Dr. Caligari sleeping besides Cesare. Now we can see Cesare entering the scene, and this too might have been very much frightening. Once again, see the way in which Cesare enters the scene. It seems as if he has just come out from the darkness, right? And the way in which he walks is again quite menacing. He places his hand on the walls and walks towards Jane's house, and his large frame, his long hands, and his slender legs together create a very menacing atmosphere. He secretively enters into Jane's household. And once again, look at the way in which Jane sleeps, and look at the way in which it is contrasted with the way in which Cesare emerges in the scene, right? See, Jane here is sleeping calmly. She is in her bed, and again the place is calm. Everything is symmetrical. Even the walls are symmetrical. There are some patterns on the walls. There is a chair here, some embellishments, maybe a mirror there. And the way in which she sleeps, she is so calm. And the bed in which she sleeps is also soft, plushy. And it is contrasted with the windowsill here. Again, with the windowsills. It is slightly tilted, right? And it is from this window that Cesare emerges. See here, he slowly enters the scene. There's a sharp contrast between dark and light here, between darkness and light. The way in which he appears suddenly on the window. Again, this might have given the audience quite a chill down their spine. So again, the man emerges from the window. He slowly removes the grills as if it is easy for him to just remove it with his one hand. On the other hand, he holds a knife. This is quite a menacing situation because now we know who actually killed Alan, Cesare. And Cesare, the murderous somnambulist, enters the scene, and now he is assigned to kill Jane. Jane is sleeping on her bed calmly, and he enters slowly. Look at the way in which he looks at her. He's ruthless, but he is not able to kill her. Something is stopping him from killing this beautiful woman. He peers at her for long, stares at her, and instead of stabbing her, he slowly places his hands on her head. Now he takes a hold of her. He tries to restrain her, and she is shocked. The others in the house, suddenly they wake up from their sleep, and Cesare takes Jane away. All the others comes in search of Jane, but she is nowhere to be seen. Dr. Olson comes to the scene, and he is heartbroken because he cannot find his daughter. They all say that they can see a man taking Jane away. Now again, see the kind of image that is used here. Again, the place that he mounts. It's quite steep, right? And everything is distorted. Again, this is sharp. It shows the madness of the narrator, right? So when Jane is introduced, everything is curvy and round, and she herself is portrayed as being calm. But all around the city, you can see these projected hills and projected landscapes. Landscape that contains lines and distorted contortions jutting into the sky. So this shows the madness that Francis is carrying within him. The film embellishes madness through lines, distorted lines, through the usage of darkness and light. So you can see here, Cesare takes Jane and climbs atop a hill. All along, Francis was watching Caligari, and it seems like there are two Cesares because Francis was also watching the somnambulist and he was sleeping all night. Now, Cesare descends down this narrow lane, and it seems like he has lost control over his body. It is true that the townsfolk chased him, but still, in that particular scene, it seems as though he has lost control over his mind and body. He's growing weak, right? It also shows that someone might have been controlling him all along, and now the control over Cesare might have been lost. So if Dr. Caligari was a puppet master who played with puppets, and if Cesare was his puppet, and if Dr. Caligari was his puppet master, then it seems like for once the strings that are attached to the puppet has been cut off. Caligari ഒരു puppet master ആണെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുക. Caligari ആണ് സിസാറിനെ കൺട്രോൾ ചെയ്യുന്നതെന്ന് വിചാരിക്കുക. ഈ ഒരു പെർട്ടിക്കുലർ സീനിൽ suddenly he grows weak, right? Cesare grows weak. So it seems like the control that Caligari had over Cesare is slowly weakening. Maybe he grew weak because of the long chase, or it can also be that Caligari is not able to control him beyond a particular distance. Here, Cesare came a long way carrying Jane, and maybe Caligari might have lost his control over Cesare because of the distance. So that is also evidently shown in this particular scene. Let me play it once again for you. See here, Cesare comes, but he's finding it hard to carry Jane, and then suddenly he looks somewhere and he's not able to carry her any further, right? So it seems like Caligari's control over Cesare might have been lost because of the distance. And now everyone in the town goes in search of Cesare. Dr. Olson and his accomplices take Jane to her house. Again, see this line. This is again a very important scene in this movie. You can see trees, but all the trees have branches which are unusually kept, right? ട്രീസിന് ഇങ്ങനെയുള്ള ബ്രാഞ്ചസ് ഉണ്ടാവാറില്ല, as if they are raising their hands. Now, this is somewhat similar to the way in which Cesare keeps his hand on the scene. And usually, in the olden days, when a somnambulist was shown on screen, often the somnambulist would walk like this, like a zombie. Right? In zombie movies, you can see zombies walking around with their hands outstretched. So, similar to that, here too, Cesare is keeping his hands outstretched. It seems like he is being controlled by someone because he is walking around trying to find his way through the dense forest. And then his powers weakens. Once again, look at the way in which his hands are placed, and slowly his power is weakened. And see this particular scene here, in this instance, it seems like somebody was controlling him, right, with strings. Like a puppet master, puppets in a control ചെയ്യുന്ന പോലെ. It seems like somebody was controlling Cesare because his hands were kept like this, as though someone is controlling him. Now, as he moves further away from Caligari, his power slowly weakens, or Caligari's control over Cesare weakens. So it seems quite clear that it was Caligari who was plotting these murders all alone, right? Because it seems like Cesare was not in control of his own body. As soon as he loses touch with Caligari, his power weakens and he falls on ground. See here? As if the strings in his hands, attached to his hands, are cut. Now here we can see that Francis somehow feels that Caligari and Cesare is not behind the murders because he has seen with his own eyes Cesare sleeping throughout the night. But somehow he comes to know that Jane has been kidnapped, so he reaches Dr. Olson's residence. There they speak with Jane, who has just regained her consciousness. She looks around and remembers the horrors that she faced, and she shouts the word Cesare. Because now she knew that it is Cesare who tried to kidnap her. And it is Cesare who murdered Alan. Now, our Francis says, it can't have been Cesare. I have been watching him for hours asleep in his box. So Francis says that it can't have been Cesare. I don't think that it might have been Cesare. I don't think that the person who tried to kidnap Jane was Cesare. Because I've been watching him all these hours and he was deep asleep in his box, in his cabinet. So how will Cesare be able to commit such a deed? That is Francis's question. On hearing this, Jane asserts it was Cesare. See, she is asserting herself. She says that it was Cesare. No matter what you say, I know what I saw with my own eyes. It was Cesare who kidnapped me. Dr. Olson offers his solace to Jane, and that is where the Act 4 ends. Now, in Act 4, again, we can see many revelations. In the beginning of Act 4, the director tries to divert our attention from Dr. Caligari and Cesare by introducing the character of a thief who had committed the murder of an old woman. We, the audience, we unmistakably knew that a man had murdered an old woman. And this man was not Cesare. Then, again, there is a diversion. Dr. Olson as well as Francis go to the police station to meet this man whom the police had captured. But here the man reveals that he did commit the murder of the old lady, and he used the same weapon that the Holston Wall murderer used because he wanted to frame the old lady's murder on Holston Wall murderer. So Holston Wall murderറിനെ ഫ്രെയിം ചെയ്യണമായിരുന്നു നമ്മുടെ തീഫിന്, നമ്മുടെ old ലേഡിയെ കൊന്ന murderറിന്. He wanted to frame Holston Wall murderer because he held a grudge against this old lady and he wanted to murder her. So when he came to know that a serial killer is let loose, he copies the serial killer. So it is a copycat murder, right? The murder of the old lady is a copycat murder. Now this kind of murders often happened. Now even they happen these days. It happened before, it still happens these days, where if a serial killer kills a person, or if he has a modus operandi and he goes around killing people in a peculiar way, then other murders too would arise and other murderers too would arise, copying this serial killer or ripper. From that, again, the scene shifts. We see Jane going in search of her father to the fair. There, Jane again meets Dr. Caligari and Cesare. She's horrified by Cesare's dead stare. He just stares at her and she's horrified. And it seems like Caligari has found his next prey in Jane. At night, Francis visits Caligari's tent in order to spy on them, but he finds nothing suspicious. Caligari sits near to Cesare and Cesare is sleeping in his cabinet. But around the same time, Cesare is seen approaching Jane's bedroom. And he approaches Jane's bedroom in a very menacing way, in a very menacing manner. The insides of Jane's bedroom is also presented. It is warm, it is calm. It is one of those places in which we don't see any distorted lines or sharp lines for that matter. Throughout this film, we can see sharp lines, distorted lines, but here in Jane's bedroom, we don't see any of such lines. Everything is symmetrical. Even her bedroom is pristine white in color, so it has a calming effect on the viewer. See here as she sleeps, the scene in which she is presented as sleeping. See, everything here is white, it's pristine white. That even the murderer who wished to kill Jane, he drops his murder weapon and just tries to put his hand over Jane's head because Jane is so innocent. And Jane is portrayed as so innocent that even the murderer couldn't kill Jane. He just places his hands over her head. And at that time, Jane wakes up. And so the murderer, Cesare, has to take her away. He takes her away to a nearby forest. Again, the landscape that is portrayed there is filled with triangular shapes. Then straight lines can be seen. And it seems like he is ascending a steep, ഒരു സ്റ്റീപ്പ് കയറി പോകുന്ന പോലെയാണ് കാണിക്കുന്നത്. He has been chased by other people, right? So he has to carry her all around. Now the others go in search of Jane and Cesare is seen carrying her through a steep, narrow path, and it seems like he has lost control over his body. He grew weak and he abandons Jane there. The others are able to rescue her, while the villagers go in search of Cesare. In the next scene, again, it is very much symbolic. Cesare is shown, and the trees all around him are menacingly placed. It appears as though the hands of trees are raised above, as though they are asking for help. And similar to the trees, you can also see Cesare and he has stretched his arm to the front. It seems like someone is controlling him, as a puppet master is controlling his puppets. So in this scene, when he falls down unconscious, it seems like someone has put a string on his hands and he falls down. So clearly, Dr. Caligari holds a sway over the somnambulist only when the somnambulist is well within his reach. And the somnambulist go to the outskirts of Holston Wall. Caligari is not able to control him. Now in the next scene, it's again quite confusing, because Francis now says that there is no way that Cesare might have kidnapped Jane, because he has been there all along. He has been to Dr. Caligari's house and he with his own eyes saw Cesare resting in his cabinet, sleeping in his cabinet, and Caligari sleeping nearby. So there was no other way that Caligari could have done the deed or that Cesare could have done the deed. But here, Jane, the innocent, naive woman who was presented at the beginning of the play, she asserts that it was Cesare who kidnapped her. See, she says Cesare, she shouts the name. And then again, she's very much sure that it was Cesare who kidnapped her. Here again, for the first time, she asserts herself and she says that it was Cesare who kidnapped her. So for the first time, we can see Jane asserting herself in this scene. So that is how Act 4 of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari ends. It's a very important scene because of the way in which everything is portrayed. So when Jane is presented and her room is presented, it is presented in a very calming manner, in a calming fashion. The background itself is filled with curvy lines as opposed to straight, distorted lines that we see elsewhere in the screen. And it also shows the control that Caligari had over Cesare. And that scene in which Cesare collapses to the ground, we can clearly see that someone was controlling Cesare all along. So it might have been Dr. Caligari. So with that revelation, we come to the end of this lecture. We'll be discussing the rest in another lecture. Thank you for listening. Take care.